The Trembling Claws. The village of Ashenmere sat at the foot of the Cinder Peaks, and for generations its people had learned one simple rule: never wander beyond the black stones at the mountain's edge. It was not a rule written in any book, nor carved into any post or gate. It did not need to be. It lived instead in the way mothers pulled their children closer when the mountain wind came down sharp and sulphurous in the evenings. It lived in the pause that came over old men when someone mentioned the Cinder Peaks too casually at the tavern, that brief stillness before they changed the subject with the practiced ease of people who had decided long ago that some things were better left undiscussed. It lived in the black stones themselves, enormous, ancient, half-buried in the earth at irregular intervals along the mountain's base, their surfaces too smooth to be natural, too deliberately spaced to be accidental. Nobody in living memory had placed them there. Nobody in living memory could say with certainty what they marked. But everyone in Ashenmere understood, in the wordless way that communities understand the things they have stopped saying aloud, that the black stones were a boundary, and boundaries existed for reasons. Sira had grown up with the rule the same as everyone else. She had heard it in her mother's voice and her grandmother's voice before that, had absorbed it the way children absorb all things told to them with quiet gravity, not through argument or explanation, but through simple repetition and the weight of the teller's certainty. As a girl, she had sometimes stood at the edge of the stone line and looked up at the Cinder Peaks, at their dark, jagged silhouettes against whatever sky the day had offered, at the occasional distant plume of smoke that rose from somewhere near the summit and dissolved before it reached the clouds, and she had felt the particular pull that forbidden things exert on children, but she had never crossed. Her mother had taught her many things: how to read grain in wood, how to feel for stress fractures in ceramic, how to splice a leather strap so the join was stronger than the original. She had also taught her that cleverness meant knowing which rules to question and which to simply respect. By the time Sira was grown, the rule had settled into something she carried without thinking about it, the way one carries the habit of checking a latch twice before sleep. She was 24 now, with capable hands perpetually marked by small cuts and resin stains, hair she kept tied back from her face with whatever cord was nearest, and a small workshop at the edge of the village that smelled permanently of sawdust and linseed oil. She was a mender. Not a carpenter, not a craftsperson in the grand sense. She made very little from scratch. What she did was take the things that people brought her, broken things, cracked things, things that had been dropped or warped or worn past the point where their owners could imagine them being useful again, and she returned them to wholeness. It was quiet work. It suited her. She had no particular reason to be near the black stones that gray morning in the early part of autumn. Her route to the forest, where she sometimes gathered pine resin and particular mosses she used in her trade, did not typically take her so far along the mountain's base. But she had started later than usual, the morning having been slow and fog-heavy, and she had taken a path slightly further north than her habit, following a line of older pines whose bark she had been meaning to examine for some months. And then she had heard it. At first she thought it was a bird. The sound was high and irregular, with a quality that tugged at something instinctive, the particular register of distress that makes the human animal stop walking and turn its head. She had stood still for a moment, listening, and heard it again. A thin, wavering sound, not quite a cry, not quite a whimper, something caught between the two in a way that suggested whatever was making it had been at it for some time and was growing tired. A small creature, she thought. Something hurt. Her feet had moved before she had properly decided to move them. She had followed the sound for perhaps 10 minutes, threading between the pines with her satchel shifted to her back, her attention narrowed to listening. It was only when the trees thinned slightly and she caught the first glimpse of the black stones through the trunks ahead of her that she realized how far north she had come. She slowed. She stood at the edge of the tree line for a moment, looking at the stones with their ancient smoothness, and then she heard the sound again, closer now and more clearly sorrowful than she had first understood it to be. Not the pain of a wound, something more complicated than that. She told herself it was only curiosity. She told herself that right up until she nearly stepped on him. He was tucked so close to the roots of a scorched pine just beyond the nearest black stone that she had not seen him until she was almost upon him. The pine itself was dead, its bark stripped, and its wood blackened in a way that looked less like lightning damage and more like something had pressed itself against it repeatedly, something warm enough to char wood through proximity alone. The roots buckled up from the earth around the base of the trunk in thick, gnarled ridges, and he was folded into the space between two of the largest roots as if he had chosen the spot deliberately, as if the roots were walls he had put his back against. He was no bigger than a large cat, this dragon hatchling, though that comparison would have struck anyone as slightly absurd given the wings, folded now, pressed tight against his body, their membranes a darker copper than his scales, threaded through with veins like the veins in a leaf held up to light. His scales themselves were extraordinary up close. Not the flat, dull color she might have imagined from a distance, but layered, slightly iridescent, so that depending on the angle of the pale morning light filtering through the pines, they shifted from deep burnished copper to something almost bronze, almost gold. He was curled in on himself with the particular density of a creature trying to make itself as small as possible, his tail wrapped around his haunches, his neck bent down so that his chin nearly touched his chest. And he was trembling, not shivering, trembling, with a sustained, full-body vibration that she could somehow feel through the ground even before she crouched closer, as though whatever emotion drove it was large enough to move out through his small body and into the earth beneath him. He trembled as though the whole world had wronged him and he had run out of ways to say so. In his tiny claws, he clutched something. She had to look twice to understand what it was, because it seemed so improbable in those small-scaled hands. A wooden figure, a horse, she realized after a moment, crudely carved but recognizable, its legs solid and thick the way carved horses' legs tend to be when the carver is more concerned with the shape lasting than with elegance. It had been painted once, red and gold, the red still visible in the protected hollows of the carving where the weather had not reached it. The gold worn almost entirely away except for a faint ghost of it along the horse's neck. The figure was split clean down the middle, a crack running from the top of the carved mane all the way down through the body to the base, and the two halves were barely held together by a single stubborn splinter that bridged the gap near the bottom. One good pull, or one tightening of those small claws, and the horse would come apart entirely. He was holding it as gently as he could. She could see the effort in his claws, the way they were curved around the figure rather than gripping it, cradling rather than clutching, trying to apply the minimum possible pressure while still keeping hold of something that clearly could not be let go of. It was the most careful thing she had ever seen an animal do. Syrah crouched slowly, the way she did around wounded animals at the market, reducing her height, making herself less of a looming presence, taking her time so that the movement itself was reassurance rather than threat. She had learned years ago that the speed of an approach told a frightened creature more than anything else about your intentions. Fast meant danger. Slow meant something else. Slow could mean many things, but it at least meant you were paying attention. The hatchling's eyes snapped open. They were molten amber, those eyes, not amber like the stone, not the fixed, cloudy color of preserved things, but amber as she imagined it must look when it is still warm from the tree, still liquid and alive. Enormous for his face, or perhaps his face simply seemed small in comparison, and startled in a way that was almost painfully legible. For one suspended moment she saw herself reflected in those great amber eyes, a crouching human with a satchel and dirty hands, and a face that she hoped was communicating something useful. And then the sound came out of him. It was somewhere between a hiss and a sob. Not a warning sound, not the aggressive hiss of a threatened creature preparing to defend itself. She had heard those from cornered cats and geese and once memorably a very unhappy goat, and she knew the difference. This was something rawer than warning. It was the sound of something caught off guard in the middle of grief, startled out of its private sorrow before it had finished with it, and it carried in it the specific vulnerability of interrupted weeping. The hiss was reflex, the automatic armor that went up when one was seen. The sob underneath it was what was real. He pulled the broken toy tighter to his chest. The splinter groaned under the pressure, and she heard it, that small wooden protest, and she watched his eyes flicker down to the horse in his claws with a panic that moved across his face quickly and clearly, the panic of someone who has just realized they are about to destroy the thing they are trying to protect. The trembling in his claws grew worse. The splinter held, barely. Syrah did not run. She was aware on some level that she probably should have. She was beyond the black stones, she was crouched 3 feet from a dragon, a small dragon, yes, a very young dragon, but a dragon nonetheless. And the sensible response to this situation was to back away slowly, return to the village, tell absolutely no one what she had seen, and spend the rest of the day doing something grounded and rational like sanding a tabletop. She was aware of all of this in the way that one is sometimes aware of the most reasonable course of action in the very moment one is choosing not to take it. She did not run. She did not speak either, because it seemed to her that speaking would be a kind of intrusion, that words would fill the space between them before she had earned the right to fill it, before she had given him enough time to decide what kind of thing she was. She had no frame of reference for what a dragon hatchling understood about human beings or human language, but she had a great deal of experience with frightened creatures, and her experience told her that what frightened creatures needed first, before anything else, was time. Just time. The space to keep breathing and discover that the alarming thing was not, in fact, coming closer. The chance to feel the situation stabilize around them before they were asked to process anything more complicated. So she simply sat. She settled herself cross-legged in the cold dirt. The ground was slightly damp, autumn having been wet, and she felt the chill immediately through her trousers. but she arranged her face into the expression of someone who was perfectly comfortable and had nowhere particular to be, and she put her hands in her lap, open and visible. And she watched him with the same quiet patience she used when coaxing a broken buckle back into shape. The patience of someone who understood that the work had its own timeline, and that forcing it was the surest way to ruin it. He watched her back. His amber eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that she suspected was less aggression than assessment. He was reading her, she thought, the way all animals read the unfamiliar, measuring her against whatever categories he had available. Threat or not threat, dangerous or merely strange. She met his gaze without starring, which she had also learned was a distinction worth making. Looking at a creature and staring at a creature were different things, carried different weights, and she kept her eyes soft and her attention calm and let him look at her as long as he needed to. The wind moved through the pines. It came from higher on the mountain, and it carried with it a faint warmth that seemed counterintuitive given the gray autumn sky, a deep mineral warmth like the air above a hearth, laced with something sulphurous that was not unpleasant exactly but was very distinctly not forest. It moved the dead pine's remaining branches in a slow creak overhead. It moved the edge of Sierra's coat. It moved across the hatchling's folded wings, and he closed his eyes briefly against it. And when he opened them again, something in his face had shifted. Some degree of the acute panic had subsided into something more watchful and less frantic. She noticed that the trembling in his claws had changed. It had not stopped, he was still trembling, still sustaining that deep, involuntary vibration, but the quality of it had altered in some way she could not quite have named. Before, the trembling had seemed total, had seemed to involve his entire small body without distinction. Now it felt slightly more concentrated, as though it had retreated from the edges of him and gathered itself into his hands, into the specific problem of the broken horse and the insufficient splinter and the terrifying task of holding on without pressing too hard. The rest of him had eased just slightly, just enough. Just enough that the hiss was no longer sitting at the surface of him ready to happen again. Just enough that he had stopped pressing himself backward into the roots as if he could push himself through the wood and the earth and disappear entirely. He was still small and still copper-scaled and still cradling a broken toy with a carefulness that was heartbreaking to look at directly, but he was no longer bracing for something terrible, and Sierra counted that as a beginning. She sat in the cold dirt and watched the mountain wind move through the pines and thought about the broken horse, about the crack running clean through it and the single splinter bridging the halves, and the way he had pulled it closer when startled and then understood immediately, more quickly than she would have expected, what that pulling might cost. That was the thing that had lodged in her, that flicker of comprehension in those great amber eyes, the panic that was not about her but about the toy, the adjustment of pressure that followed. That was not simple animal instinct. That was something that recognized what it held as irreplaceable. She wondered who had carved it. She wondered how long he had had it, how he had come to be here alone beyond the black stones with his wings pressed flat and his whole body shaking around a grief she could not name. She wondered where his kind went when they were small and hurting, whether there was somewhere up in the cinder peaks that was the equivalent of the scorched pine's roots, a place you went when you needed to be contained, to have your back against something solid while you shook. She did not wonder about these things aloud. She sat with them quietly, the way she sat with most things, and she let the space between them remain undemanding, and she watched the trembling in his claws ease by increments so small they were almost invisible. The morning moved around them both. The fog began to lift in the way autumn fog lifts, slowly, without drama, the light becoming merely gray rather than gray and muffled. A bird called somewhere deeper in the pines, and the hatchling's eyes moved toward the sound for a moment before returning to her. His tail uncurled slightly from around his haunches and then, seeming to reconsider, curled back. He adjusted his grip on the broken horse with excruciating delicacy, and the splinter held, and something in the set of his small shoulders released a degree of tension that had been there since she had sat down. Sierra watched all of this and kept her hands in her lap and her face steady and her breathing even, and she thought, "There is a crack running through the middle of it, and the wood around the splinter is stressed. And if I had my kit, I could clean the edges and set them properly, and with the right adhesive and a little brass wire to hold the join while it cured, it would be stronger at the break than it ever was whole." She thought this the way she thought about most broken things, not as a project, not as an opportunity, but simply as a fact she had noticed, a thing her hands and her training had registered without being asked to. A broken thing and a way to mend it. That was all. She did not move toward him. She did not reach into her satchel. She simply sat in the cold dirt at a respectful distance, and the wind came down from the cinder peaks with its mineral warmth, and the trembling in his claws eased just slightly, just enough, and the morning continued, gray and quiet and strange, around the two of them. And the broken horse, held together by a splinter, rested in his careful claws between them like a question neither of them had spoken yet. The mending. The moment Sierra decided to reach into her satchel, She understood that the decision itself was the most important part of what she was about to do. Not the mending, not yet. The mending was craft, and craft she trusted. What came before the craft, the approach, the communication of intention to a creature who shared no language with her, who had every reason to interpret a sudden movement as threat, that was the thing that required the most care. She had learned this in her years of work, that the preparation for a mending was as consequential as the mending itself, that the way you handled a broken thing in the moments before you began was often what determined whether the thing could be saved at all. Rush it, and you damaged what was already fragile. Move without thinking, and the crack became a break. She reached into the satchel at her hip without looking away from him. This was deliberate. Looking away, she had found, was its own kind of statement. It said that you were no longer paying attention, which could mean either that you had decided the other creature was unimportant or that you were distracted by something else, and neither of those readings was reassuring to something small and frightened. She kept her eyes on him, soft and steady, and she let her hands work from memory, which was where all of her best work lived anyway. Her fingers found the strap of the mending kit by touch, and eased it loose from the satchel with no more urgency than if she were reaching for something on a familiar shelf. She moved with deliberate slowness, as if every gesture were a word in a language she was only beginning to learn. Because that was what it was, she thought. She had no other language here. No words he would understand, no shared history, no context beyond the last half hour of cold ground and careful stillness and the broken horse trembling between his claws. What she had was the language of movement, of pace and intention communicated through the body, through the speed and character of action, and she was not yet fluent in his dialect of it. She did not know exactly what read as threatening to him, what read as neutral, what might somehow read as kind. She was guessing, extrapolating from everything she knew about frightened creatures and from the small data she had gathered in the last 30 minutes of watching him. She was learning as she went, and so she went slowly, because slowness at least bought her time to read his reactions and adjust. From the satchel, she drew her mending kit. It was a small roll of leather, dark brown and supple from years of handling, held shut by a length of cord wound twice around it. She had made the kit herself, or rather she had assembled it over years from components she had acquired or fashioned piece by piece, adding and refining as her work taught her what she needed. The leather was from a coat her mother had worn until it could not be worn anymore, and Sierra had cut it herself on the night after the funeral and made something useful from it because that was what she knew how to do with grief. She unrolled it now with the same unhurried care she gave everything, laying it open flat on the ground before her so that its contents were visible. The kit revealed itself in sections. On the left side, held in small leather loops, the tools. Fine-toothed saws no bigger than a finger, their teeth kept sharp enough to feel dangerous against a careful thumb. A bone-handled, all worn smooth where her palm met it. 2 knives of different sizes, both kept keener than most people kept their kitchen blades. A pair of pliers with narrow jaws for the wire work. A small clamp no longer than her hand, which she had modified herself by wrapping its grip in a scrap of wool so it would not conduct cold into whatever it held. On the right side, settled into individual pockets, the materials. Pots of wood glue sealed with beeswax, 3 of them in graduated sizes, their lids worn from opening with cold fingers in outdoor light. A pot of the wood stain she mixed herself from iron oxide and linseed, which she kept in a pot that had once held shoe polish and still faintly smelled of it. A 4th, smallest pot sealed more carefully than the others that held the paint. And coiled in the last pocket, lengths of brass wire thin as thread, dull gold in the gray morning light, each length exactly the same because she cut them the same each time. She set each piece out on the ground between them, one at a time. This was another deliberate choice. She could have simply unrolled the kit and left it as it was, everything visible at once, and begun. But she was aware that a roll of leather full of unfamiliar objects might read as either incomprehensible or alarming, and she wanted to give him the opportunity to understand each thing before she moved to the next. So she took the items out one at a time and placed them on the ground with care, the way she had once watched a healer in Ashenmere set out the instruments of his work before an anxious child, not hiding anything, not rushing, letting the display itself be the explanation. She arranged them as if laying an offering on an altar, not carelessly, but with a sense that the arrangement mattered, that there was a rightness to how things were placed in relation to one another and in relation to the space between herself and the hatchling. He watched every item emerge. She could see him tracking each one, the quick amber flicker of his eyes from her hands to the object she placed, back to her hands to the next object. It was not the fixed, wary stare he had given her at the beginning. This was different. This was active, investigative, a quality of attention that wanted information rather than simply monitoring for danger. She found this encouraging without letting herself lean into the encouragement too hard, because encouragement was the thing that most reliably caused people to move too quickly. When the last item was placed, she waited. She let him look at the arrangement on the ground between them and decide what he thought of it. His neck, she noticed, had extended slightly. He had leaned forward by some small degree without appearing to have decided to do so, drawn toward the unfamiliar objects by something she recognized as curiosity working against caution. She had seen this in animals before, in children before. The pull of the interesting thing and the resistance of the afraid thing, working against each other until one of them won. The hatchling stretched his neck forward and sniffed at the little pots. He went for the glue pots first, which made a certain sense. They were the most visually distinct, the most object-like in their small, sealed roundness. She heard him inhale, a careful, deliberate sniff that was surprisingly precise for a creature of his age, as if he had learned already to be methodical about gathering information. The beeswax seal on the largest pot seemed to interest him. He sniffed it twice, then moved to the second pot, then the smallest. Then he moved to the paint pot, and here he paused longer, and she wondered what the smell of it told him, whether it was simply novel or whether it registered as something he recognized from somewhere. He sneezed a curl of pale smoke. It was such an unexpected thing to witness, the sudden scrunch of his scaled face, the eyes squeezing briefly shut, and then the pale gray-white smoke that curled upward from his nostrils in a thin spiral and dissipated in the cold morning air within seconds. It happened so fast and was so completely undignified, and was so clearly as surprising to him as it was to her, that Sierra had to exert genuine effort to keep her face from changing. Not because her face changing would necessarily have been bad, but because she did not know yet whether the expression that wanted to come to her face would read correctly, and she did not want to startle him with an expression at exactly the wrong moment. He looked at her. It was a different kind of looking than before, still watchful, yes, still carrying the careful assessment of a creature that had not yet made up its mind about her, but something about the sneeze had altered the texture of the moment slightly. The absolute tension of the earlier watching had eased by some small margin. There was, she thought, something almost sheepish in his amber eyes, though she was aware she might be projecting. He looked at her with what she could only describe as cautious interest, not the guarded monitoring of the frightened, and not yet the openness of the comfortable, but something occupying the careful middle ground between them. She held out her hand, palm up, and waited. She kept her arm low, not reaching toward him but extending outward from her body with the elbow slightly bent. The way she had learned not to offer a hand to a strange dog, not thrust forward, not hovering above, but offered from below, from a position that required him to come to it rather than having it come to him. The palm-up posture she had adopted on instinct, because palm-up felt different from palm-down in some way she had never managed to articulate precisely but had always understood in the body. It was receiving rather than reaching. It was making space rather than filling it. She did not look at the horse in his claws, she looked at his face. It took a long time. Long enough for the quality of the gray sky to shift as clouds moved across it, swallowing the pale suggestion of sun that had been filtering through and then releasing it again, so that the light between the pines pulsed slowly from dim to slightly less dim and back. Long enough for the cold of the ground to work its way up through the fabric of her trousers and settle into her knees, first as a mild awareness and then as a persistent ache that she acknowledged and set aside. Long enough for a small wind to come through the trees twice, carrying its mineral warmth both times, and for the hatchling's eyes to remain on her throughout both gusts, unmoving, unblinking for stretches that were longer than she had expected. She did not hurry. She had made her offer and she was content to let it stand until he had finished thinking about it, however long that required. This was the part of mending that most people did not understand, not the technique, not the knowledge of materials and joins and adhesives, but this, the willingness to let the work take as long as it needed. The willingness to be present in the waiting without filling the waiting with movement or noise or the anxious reassurances that were really reassurances to oneself. The waiting was part of the mending. Sometimes it was most of it. She thought about the horse while she waited. She thought about what it would need. The crack was clean, which was good. A clean crack was easier to set than a splintered or ragged one, easier to bring back into true alignment before the glue set. The wood was old and dry, which meant it would absorb the glue well, would draw it into the grain and hold it there. The splinter that had been maintaining the join was both helpful and a problem. Helpful because it had kept the two halves from shifting relative to each other, from drifting as split things drift, so the alignment would likely still be good. A problem because removing it or working around it required care, because wood under sustained stress found its own way of being fragile in unexpected directions. She would need to check the stress lines before she applied anything. She would need to clean the split surfaces carefully, because old wood accumulated oils and dust, and anything on the mating surfaces would compromise the bond. She thought about the paint. The red was still visible in the protected hollows, and she had the right red in her kit, the iron oxide mix that she used for wood that had been painted in the old style, the style that had been common a generation or two ago in this region before the cheaper paints had come in from the southern trade routes. She thought about whether to repaint the whole figure or only fill the crack. Repainting the whole thing would be more complete, but it would also change it, would make it look more finished, more new, and new was not always what a beloved thing needed to look. Sometimes what a beloved thing needed was to look like itself, only mended, only held. She would fill the crack in the worn places and leave the rest as it was. She thought about the gold on the mane. There was barely any left, just the ghost of it, but she had the gold in her kit. She kept it for exactly this kind of work, for things that had been made with care and had worn down to the memory of their own decoration. She would put it back. And then, with a gravity that seemed far too large for his small body, the hatchling placed the broken horse into her palm. He did it with both claws, she noticed. He used both hands in the way that a child uses both hands to give something precious, not trusting one hand alone with the full weight of the transfer. He set it into her palm from above, lowering it slowly, and she felt the weight of it settle against her skin, lighter than she had expected and warmer, warmed by his claws, the wood carrying a heat it had absorbed from him. The crack ran through the center of the warmth. She closed her fingers around it gently, not gripping, just surrounding, and she looked down at it for the first time with her full attention. Up close, the carving was better than she had thought from a distance. Crude, yes, the proportions were approximate, the legs uniform where a more accomplished carver would have differentiated them, the face more suggested than rendered. But there was something in it, some quality of intention that transcended the technical limitations. A care in the overall shape that spoke of a maker who had known exactly what they were trying to make even if the tools or the skill had not quite gotten them all the way there. The horse was running. She could see that now all four legs were extended in the position of a full gallop, and whoever had carved it had known enough about horses to get this right, to understand that a running horse is not the same shape as a standing one. Someone who had watched horses run, someone who had wanted to keep that. She began to work. She reached for the soft cloth first, a square of undyed wool she kept folded in the kit's front pocket, and she used it to clean the split surfaces. She worked with her smallest tools, clearing the accumulated dust and the oils from his claws from the edges of the crack, preparing the wood to receive the glue. She worked slowly and with full attention, the kind of attention that required her to narrow her awareness to the square inch of wood she was currently occupied with, to feel with her fingertips what her eyes could not quite see, to understand the grain and the stress lines and the specific character of this particular piece of wood. Because all wood was individual, and all mending was a conversation with the specific thing in front of you rather than the application of general principles to an abstract problem. The hatchling watched. She could feel his attention as a kind of warmth, or perhaps it was just the faint emanation of heat from his scales in the cold air. He did not move closer. He did not retreat. He remained exactly where he was in the space between the roots of the scorched pine, and he watched her hands with those great amber eyes, and he was still. She applied the wood glue with a brush no wider than a pine needle, working it into the split edges with the same care she brought to every step. The beeswax seal on the pot had kept it perfectly. The consistency was right, neither too thick nor too thin, and it went into the grain of the old wood exactly as she had expected it would, absorbed cleanly along the split surfaces, leaving just enough on the face of the crack to create the bond when the two halves were brought together. She checked the alignment before she pressed them, held both halves in her hands and turned them slowly, examining how they met, confirming that the split had been clean enough that the original surfaces would find each other again without coaxing. They would. She pressed them together with firm, even pressure and held them. The brass wire came next. She cut 4 lengths from the coil with the small pliers, each the same, working by feel as she continued to apply pressure to the join with her other hand. She wrapped the wire around the figure at intervals above the break, across it, below it, and twisted each end tight enough to hold without cutting into the old wood. The wire was thin enough that it would not damage the painted surfaces, but strong enough to hold the join under the pressure of the glue curring. She had done this many times, with many different objects. Her hands knew the work and did it while the rest of her remained aware of the hatchling, of the quality of his stillness, of the morning moving around them. She smoothed the seam with the worn sandpaper until her fingertips knew it by touch alone. This was her measure, not her eyes, not any instrument, but her fingertips, which over years had developed a sensitivity to surface that she trusted more than any tool. She ran the ball of her thumb along the mended seam and felt for the roughness that meant more work was needed, and she worked until she felt only smoothness, the slight give of the old painted wood on either side of the line where the glue had set. Then she opened the paint pots. The red went on in thin layers, which was the only way to do it properly, thin layers that built on each other rather than a single thick application that would dry uneven and crack again. She filled the visible line of the seam first, then the places where the red had worn away from the surfaces nearest the crack, blending each layer into the old paint at its edges so that the distinction between new and old softened rather than announced itself. She worked with the finest of her 3 brushes, and she did not rush, and the hatchling did not move. The gold she saved for last. She had mixed this particular gold herself, a paint she was quietly proud of, with a warmth to it that the commercial gold she had tried never achieved. She loaded the finest brush with it and she put the line back along the horse's mane, following the ghost of the original that was still just barely visible if you knew to look for it, restoring it to where it had been rather than inventing something new. She thought, as she laid the line down, of her mother doing exactly this for the toys that came to her mending table when Sierra was small. The care her mother had taken with the painted details. The way she had always said that the decoration mattered as much as the structure, that a thing should be returned to itself completely if it was to be returned at all. When she set the horse down on the ground between them, it stood on all four legs whole. The wire was still on it, the glue needed more time to cure fully, and she would have recommended leaving it wrapped for another day, though she suspected this was not a recommendation she was in a position to enforce. But the join was good. She could see it and she knew it in the way she knew all her work, with the particular confidence that came not from pride but from having attended carefully to every step. The red was right. The gold on the mane caught the gray morning light and gave it back warmer than it had arrived. The hatchling stared at it for a long moment. She watched his face while he looked at the horse. She had learned, over years of returning things to their owners, that this was the most important moment, not the mending itself, but the first moment of the receiving, when the person, or the creature as it turned out, looked at the thing they had trusted you with and discovered what you had done with that trust. She had learned to read people in this moment, and she read him now as carefully as she had read the wood. The stillness of him, the quality of his attention as his amber eyes moved over the mended figure, taking in the clean join, the painted red, the line of gold along the mane. Then he made a sound. It was low and resonant and strange, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in him than the sounds he had made before, deeper than the hiss-sob of the startled, deeper than the small vocalizations he had made while watching her work, which had been higher and more variable and which she had tried not to interpret too specifically. This sound was different. It had a sustained quality, a warmth in the lower registers that she felt as much as heard, and it was so entirely unlike anything she had a category for that she found herself simply receiving it without reaching for a comparison, letting it be what it was rather than what she could name. A sound no book in Ashenmere had ever thought to record, because Ashenmere had never been in the habit of being close enough to hear it. He picked the horse up with both claws. He held it the way he had held it before, with both hands, cradling rather than gripping, the same instinctive care for something precious. But the trembling that had been in his claws since she first saw him, the sustained, full-body shaking that had been the first thing she had noticed, and the thing that had told her more than anything else about the size of what he was carrying, that trembling was gone. His claws were steady. The horse rested in them without the wire of tension that had been there before, without the terrible delicacy of a creature trying to hold something together through will alone because it was all that remained. He held it now without trembling. Sierra looked at her hands in her lap, at the red paint and the gold on her fingertips, at the worn, familiar surfaces of her tools laid out on the ground between them. She thought about picking them up and packing them away. She thought about the cold in her knees and the morning that had moved further along than she had realized, the light slightly changed, the fog entirely gone now from between the trees. She thought about the village at the foot of the mountain, and the workshop that smelled of sawdust and linseed oil, and the buckle she had left unfinished on her workbench that morning. She did not move yet. She sat for a moment longer in the cold dirt beyond the black stones, with the mountain wind coming down through the pines, and she let the work settle around her the way completed work always settled, quietly, without announcement, simply present now in the world in a way it had not been before. The horse stood on its four legs in his steady claws, whole and warm, the gold on its mane catching the light. The trust she did not see. Sierra packed her kit the way she always packed it. Methodically, each piece returned to its specific place in the leather roll, the tools wiped clean before they went back into their loops. The glue pots checked that their beeswax seals were properly seated, the brass wire coiled and tucked into its pocket without kinking. She did this without rushing and without dawdling, with the same even attention she brought to the work itself, because her mother had taught her that the care you gave your tools was the care you could expect from them, and she had never found reason to argue with this. The cold had settled properly into her knees while she sat, and when she stood she felt it, the specific complaint of joints that have been held in one position on cold ground for longer than they found acceptable. She straightened slowly, pressing one hand briefly to her left knee in the way she had developed as an acknowledgement rather than a remedy, and she used the other hand to brush the pine needles and the damp dirt from the back of her trousers and the hem of her coat. The coat had a smear of red paint on the left cuff where she had rested it against the wrong surface at some point during the work. She noted this without particular feeling. Paint came out of wool if you caught it early enough, and if it didn't, it became part of the coat's record of use, which was its own kind of story. She glanced once more at the hatchling. He was turned slightly away from her now, or rather he had rotated in the way that creatures rotate when they have stopped monitoring something and returned to their own private concerns. Not a rejection, simply a reorientation of attention. He held the mended horse in both claws and he was turning it over and over with a focus so complete that the rest of the world seemed to have receded from him. The cold morning and the pine trees, and the woman who had been sitting in his company for the better part of 2 hours, all falling away to the periphery of a concentration that had room in it only for the thing he held. He turned the horse slowly, examining each surface in turn. He ran the edge of one small claw along the mended seam with a delicacy that was startling. He tilted it so that the line of gold on the mane caught the gray morning light and held it. She recognized what she was looking at. She did it herself at the end of every job, picked the thing up and turned it in the light and felt every surface and examined every join, not because she doubted her own work, but because the examination was its own kind of completion, a closing of the circle that had begun when the broken thing first came into her hands. The work was not finished until you had looked at it properly. Until you had confirmed with your full attention that it was what you had meant it to be. She had never seen it done by anyone other than herself in quite that way, with quite that quality of total absorption, and seeing it now in those small copper-scaled hands produced in her a feeling she did not immediately have a name for. She gave a small nod to him, or perhaps to the moment, or perhaps to both, since they had become in some way the same thing, and she turned to walk back down toward the black stones and the village. She did not look back, that was simply her way. She had learned it from watching people who did look back, who stood in the doorway of a completed job and made their farewells 3 times, who returned to check on work they had already checked, who needed the leaving to be witnessed or acknowledged before it felt real. She understood the impulse. She did not share it. When a thing was done, it was done, and the looking back did not add anything to it, and there was always the next thing waiting. She walked between the pines with her satchel settled on her back and her repacked kit at her hip and her coat collar turned up against the mountain wind, and she did not look back. She was thinking about the buckle on her workbench. But the hatchling watched her go. He had heard her stand, heard the small sounds of it, the shift of fabric and the brush of needles being cleared away and the soft creak of the leather satchel being resettled, and he had looked up from the horse in time to see her give the small nod and turn away. His amber eyes tracked her figure through the trees, watched the way she moved between the pines without hesitation, following a line that seemed purposeful even if he could not have said what purpose it served. She did not slow. She did not pause at the black stones, which he knew were a kind of marker, had known from a young age that those particular stones were where one world became another. She stepped between them as if they were not there and continued without altering her pace, and the gray morning gradually took her, the pines growing more numerous between them, her dark coat flickering between the trunks, and then she was gone. He looked down at the horse in his claws. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at the seam where the crack had been, which he could see but could not feel now when he ran his claw along it. It was smooth, smoother than the old painted wood on either side of it, and this smoothness over the place that had been broken was something he did not have a word for but understood in the way he understood most things, directly and completely and without the need for language to make it real. He looked at the red, deep and right, the color he remembered from when the horse was first given to him, the color that weather and time had been draining away so gradually he had almost not noticed until it was nearly gone. He looked at the gold on the mane. The gold was the thing that undid him slightly, in the private way that things undo you when there is no one watching. He had not expected the gold. He had not known to expect it, had not known that it could be put back, had not fully understood until he saw it that the ghost of gold he had been carrying in his claws all this time was the ghost of something that could be restored rather than simply mourned. It was such a small thing, a line no wider than a single careful brushstroke along the carved mane, and it was so precisely right, so exactly where it had been when the horse was whole and new and he was smaller than he was now, that for a moment he simply held it and felt the weight of it, which was the weight of something returned. He made the low resonant sound, quieter this time, more private. The sound that came from deeper in him than the sounds for communication, the sound that was not for anyone else and did not need to be, the sound that was simply the body's way of processing what the mind was working through. It moved through his chest and out into the cold air and was absorbed by the trees and the mountain wind and left no record of itself anywhere, which was as it should be. He held the horse for a while longer. Then he tucked it carefully against his chest, in the space between his folded forelegs where the scale was thicker and the warmth was greatest, and he sat in the roots of the scorched pine and he thought. It was not a simple kind of thinking. He was young enough that most of his thinking was not simple, that the concepts he was working with did not yet have the clean edges that came with age and experience, that meaning arrived in shapes that were more felt than reasoned. But he was also old enough just to know that something had happened this morning that required thought, that could not simply be filed away with other experiences under the general heading of events that occurred. Something had been different. Something had changed in a way he needed to understand, or at least to sit with until its shape became clearer. He had been alone with the broken horse for 2 days. He had come to this place because it was far enough from the places where others of his kind moved that he could be alone with it. With the fact of its breaking, which had happened in a moment of carelessness, he had not forgiven himself for and was not sure he deserved to forgive himself for, and with the grief of it, which had been larger than he had expected, larger than seemed appropriate for a piece of carved and painted wood. But grief was not always proportionate to the apparent size of what was lost. Sometimes the size of the loss was about what the thing held rather than what the thing was, and the horse held more than it appeared to from the outside. The human woman had come, and he had been startled and frightened and had made sounds he was not proud of. And she had sat down in the cold dirt, and she had not moved, and she had not spoken, and she had waited. And he had looked at her for a long time, trying to determine what she was going to do, and she had done nothing. She had simply been there steadily and without demand. And eventually he had understood that the being there was itself the thing she was doing, and it was neither threatening nor neutral but was something he did not have a category for. Something that required a new category. And then she had taken things from her bag and laid them out. And he had looked at the things, the small precise tools, the sealed pots, and he had understood in a gradual way what they were for, what she was offering not with words because there were no shared words but with the arrangement itself, with the fact of the tools and their particularity and the clear purposefulness of their display. She was offering to mend it. She was asking, with objects instead of language, whether he would let her. He had thought about this for a long time. He had weighed it the way he weighed unfamiliar things, against everything he knew and everything he felt, and what he knew was very little about human beings in general and nothing at all about this one, and what he felt was the specific texture of the last 2 days, which had been heavy and solitary and had not resulted in the horse being any less broken. And then she had held out her hand, palm up, low, waiting, and something in the posture of it had been readable to him even across the distance of their entirely different kinds. And he had understood that she was not taking but receiving, and the difference mattered. He had placed the horse in her hand. And she had mended it. He had watched every part of it, had watched the small cloth cleaning the crack, had watched the brush with its load of glue moving along the split wood with a precision that required its own kind of stillness, had watched the wire wrapped and twisted with a practiced efficiency that told him she had done this many times, that her hands knew the work the way his knew flight and fire, from the deep familiarity of repetition. He had watched her hold the two halves together while the glue set, holding pressure without movement for longer than he would have been patient doing himself. He had watched the sandpaper and then the paint and then the gold, and he had understood that each step was necessary and that she had not skipped any of them, had not found any of them beneath her attention. She had given it the same care she would have given, he suspected, to anything. Not because it was his, not because she knew what it meant to him, not because she was performing anything for his benefit. Simply because it was broken and she knew how to mend it, and so she did, and she did it completely. This was the thing he kept returning to, not the skill, though the skill was real and he respected it, but the completeness. The gold on the mane that no one had asked for, that he had not asked for because he had not known it could be restored, that she had put back because it had been there, and a complete mending meant returning the thing to itself entirely. She had not stopped at functional. She had gone all the way to whole. He sat in the roots of the scorched pine with the horse warm against his chest, and he thought about this for the rest of the morning. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen at Syrah's workshop. She arrived one morning, the sky still pale and the village not fully awake yet, to find something sitting on her windowsill. She noticed it from 10 feet away, an irregularity in the silhouette of the sill that had not been there the evening before, and she approached it with the mild curiosity she brought to unexpected things, which was neither alarm nor excitement but a straightforward interest in what the thing turned out to be. It was a geode, roughly the size of both her fists together, its outer surface the dull gray-brown of ordinary river rock, cracked open cleanly so that the interior was exposed. The interior was purple, deep amethyst crystal formations that caught the early light and held it in small, brilliant points across every facet. She picked it up with both hands and turned it in the way she turned everything interesting, examining it from multiple angles, feeling the weight of it and the sharp-edged geometry of the crystals against her palms. It was a fine specimen. Someone with a good eye had chosen it. She looked up and down the lane. The village was quiet. She carried the geode inside and set it on the shelf above her workbench, where the light from the window would reach it in the afternoons, and she went back to the buckle she had been meaning to finish for 3 days. She thought children. The village had a persistent population of children who found her workshop interesting in the way that workshops are interesting to children, full of tools and materials and the smell of productive work, presided over by an adult who was too absorbed in what she was doing to manage them very actively. They brought her things sometimes, offerings in the manner of children who want to be taken seriously, small objects they considered remarkable. She had received, over the years, an unusual stone, several interestingly shaped sticks, one very dead beetle preserved by some accident of conditions into a kind of natural specimen, and a piece of glass worn round and opaque by river water, which she had kept because it was genuinely beautiful. The geode fit the pattern. Then a river-smoothed piece of obsidian appeared 3 days later on the same windowsill. Black and glassy, its surface worked smoothed by water over a span of time she could not calculate. It caught the light differently than the geode, not by multiplying it into points but by holding it in a single dark gleam reflective as still water. She picked this up too and looked at it and thought, someone knows what they're looking for when they look. Someone is choosing these specifically and not grabbing whatever comes to hand. She thought this with approval, the way she approved of other people's precision, and she set the obsidian beside the geode on the shelf and returned to her work. Then the tooth appeared. This one stopped her. She came to her workshop door in the early morning to find it propped against the frame, not lying on the ground, not left carelessly, but propped deliberately, leaning against the door at an angle that would make it immediately visible to whoever opened the door from the inside, positioned like a delivered letter. And it was enormous, curved. Longer than her forearm, broad at the root and tapering to a point that was not sharp exactly but was unambiguous about what it had been designed for. The surface was smooth in the way that old bone is smooth, with a faint translucence where it was thinnest, and at the root there was a ring of slightly rougher surface that told the story of where it had been seeded and then released, naturally, cleanly, the way teeth release when they are ready. She picked it up, she turned it in both hands. She looked at the size of it, at the curve of it, at the weight of it, which was considerable, and she thought several things in sequence. She thought, this is not from any animal I know. She thought whoever left this carried it a considerable distance, because there is no animal of this size anywhere near Ashenmere. She thought slightly more slowly than the previous thoughts. This is the third thing, the third specific, carefully chosen, deliberately placed thing, on my windowsill and at my door. She stood in her doorway for a moment holding the tooth and looking at the empty lane and listening to the village beginning its morning around her. And she thought about it the way she thought about everything, directly, without rushing to a conclusion, attending to what the evidence actually said rather than what she might prefer it to say. Then she thought children and carried the tooth inside. She set it on the shelf with the geode and the obsidian, where it looked extraordinary and entirely out of proportion with everything around it. And she noted with a professional part of her mind that the tooth's surface would benefit from a light application of the oil she used for old bone and ivory, which would preserve the translucence and prevent any future cracking. She made a mental note to do this, and then forgot about it for the rest of the morning, because the cabinet hinge she was working on required her complete attention. The village folk noticed the things on her shelf, because village folk notice everything and then discuss it at length in the locations villages designate for such discussions. The tavern, the well, the stretch of fence between the bakers and the butchers where people paused on errands. They whispered with the particular relish of communities that have a mystery to occupy them, and the whispers accumulated detail and speculation as whispers do, growing more elaborate with each retelling, acquiring the flavors of whoever was doing the telling. Sira heard fragments of it. The village was not large enough to entirely shield anyone from the circulation of its whispers, and she received each fragment with the same mild expression she received most things, which communicated neither confirmation nor denial, but simply the fact of a person who had heard you and was not particularly alarmed. She said nothing. She assumed it was children. She thought nothing more of it. She did not know. She did not know that the geode had been carried down from a place 300 feet up the cinder peaks, where a seam of amethyst ran through the granite at an angle that made the deposits visible only from above. Visible only to something that moved at altitude and had eyes that could distinguish the particular dull gleam of geode skin from the surrounding rock. She did not know that it had been selected from among dozens of possible specimens with the same focused, methodical attention she had seen applied to the Mendied horse, turned and examined and compared against the others, and returned to the deposit twice before being chosen, because the choosing mattered and should not be rushed. She did not know that it had been carried down in claws that held it as carefully as they had once held a broken toy, with the specific delicacy of something that understood that the wrong pressure would crack what it was transporting. She did not know about the obsidian, which had come from a riverbed further east than anyone in Ashenmere had reason to travel, a riverbed that ran black with volcanic stone and could only be reached overland in several days of walking, or in a fraction of that time by something that did not need to stay on the ground. She did not know that the piece left on her sill had been fished from the river with some difficulty, the current being stronger than expected in the autumn rains, and had been dried and turned in the light repeatedly over the course of an afternoon until the specific quality of its surface, The way it held a gleam without multiplying it, the way its darkness had a depth to it that was not simply absence of light, had been recognized as right. As the right kind of beautiful for a person who collected beautiful things and understood them. She did not know about the long consideration that had preceded the tooth, the uncertainty about whether it was appropriate, whether a shed tooth was a different kind of gift than a found stone, whether the intimacy of it was too much or exactly right. She did not know that the decision had ultimately been made on the grounds that it was the most irreplaceable thing that could be given, the thing that could only come from the giver and could not be picked up from a riverbed or a mountain seam, and that this irreplaceability was what made it correct for the purpose, which was the same purpose a mender served when she put gold back on a mane that no one had asked her to restore. She did not know that each night, moving between shadows too large and too careful to belong to any child, a copper-scaled creature circled her workshop once. Not twice, not 3 times, once, with the deliberate sufficiency of a creature that had decided once was the appropriate number and saw no reason to exceed it. The circuit took him along the lane, past the front door where the tooth had leaned like a letter, along the side wall where the window held whatever light the night had to offer, around the back where her small store of wood was stacked under an oilcloth, and back to the lane. He moved with the careful attention of something learning a geography, noting the doors and the windows, the approaches and the angles, the places where the shadows pooled and where they thinned, building in his mind a map of the place that he was adding to each night, detail by detail, becoming more complete. He did not fully understand, if understanding required the kind of explicit articulation that could be examined and questioned, why he did this. He was young enough that many of his motivations lived below the level where they could be named. What he knew was that something had shifted on the morning beyond the black stones, had shifted in a way that changed the arrangement of the world and his place in it, and that the shift required a response, and that the response was this: the circling, the gifts on the sill, the careful nightly accounting of the building and its surroundings. The response was attention, which was the only currency he currently had in sufficient quantity. She did not know that trust in a dragon is not given lightly or quickly, that it is in fact among the most considered of their qualities, not because they are suspicious by nature, though caution is in them as it is in all things that have survived long enough to develop characteristics, but because they understand the weight of it. They understand that trust is not a feeling but a decision, and that decisions of this magnitude should be made with full information and appropriate deliberation. They understand that what you trust something with is not just the current moment but all the moments that come after, the whole unrolling future of a relationship, and that this is a large thing to commit to and should be treated as such. She did not know that when it came, this trust, considered and decided rather than simply felt, it came completely. Without reservation, without the hedging that would allow for comfortable retraction, without the partial commitments that could be taken back without too much damage. It came like a stone dropped into still water, which does not negotiate with the surface about how far the ripples should travel, which simply falls and lets the water carry the consequence of its falling as far as the water will carry it. It was this completeness that made it rare. It was this completeness that made it worth the consideration. She had mended a broken toy. She had sat in cold dirt and laid her tools out like offerings and waited for as long as the waiting required, and she had cleaned the crack and set the join and painted the red and restored the gold that no one had asked to be restored. And she had placed the horse back on the ground and let it stand on its 4 legs without requiring any acknowledgement of what she had done. And he had watched her walk away without looking back, and he had understood something from this too, from the not looking back, from the way she had nodded to the moment and turned and simply moved on to the next thing, as if the mending had been complete in itself and required nothing further from him, no gratitude, no witness, no reciprocity. He had understood that she had not mended the horse in order to be owed something. He had understood that this was simply what she did, and that she did it with everything, and that it was not about him specifically but that it was also in the most important way entirely about him, because he had been the one whose horse was broken, and she had been the one who fixed it, and that exchange was real regardless of whether it had been performed for an audience. He had decided in his wordless and absolute way that she was someone the world should keep. And so he kept her in the only way available to him, with circling and with watching and with gifts chosen as carefully as she had chosen her brushstrokes, with a nightly accounting that said, "I know where you are, and I know the shape of the place that holds you, and I am paying attention." He kept her the way young things keep what they have decided matters, without fully understanding the decision, without a plan beyond the keeping itself, with the complete and uncomplicated commitment of a creature that had not yet learned to want anything back. The tooth leaned against her door like a delivered letter. The gold on the mane caught the morning light in the workshop, on the shelf between the geode and the obsidian every day. She thought nothing more of it. He thought of nothing else.